I almost deleted the alert without reading it. 3 seconds, maybe 4, that's all the decision took. I forgot about it within the hour. It would be months before I understood that those 3 seconds were the reason everything that follows happened at all. It was a Monday morning in October. I was sitting in the guest house behind my son's property, drinking the first cup of coffee I'd made myself, since Rosa had brought it to me the morning before, when the notification slid quietly across the top of my tablet screen. Unusual stress pattern detected. Kitchen zone, 7:14 a.m. Marcus had explained the system to me once, back when he first installed it. It didn't recognize emotions. He'd said nothing could. Not really. It simply noticed unusual combinations of noise, movement, and activity that sometimes lined up with stress. I remember thinking that sounded like marketing dressed up as intelligence. A fancy way of saying the microphone had picked up someone raising their voice. I set the tablet face down and went back to my coffee. I'd been wrong about things like that before. I would be wrong about this one for longer than I'm proud of. I am 68 years old, widowed 4 years back when Linda passed from a cardiac event that gave us no warning and no time to argue with. I live in the guest house, and I take my walks and I mind my business, which is something I say out loud more than I actually do. 30 years as a city dispatcher taught me one thing above all else. Patterns don't lie, even when people do. I didn't know yet that this habit of mind, noticing when something repeats, was about to matter more than my knee replacement or my retirement ever had. My son Marcus built his software company from a spare bedroom and a borrowed laptop into something that employs 43 people, and watching him do it was one of the great quiet pleasures of my life. He'd married Olivia 3 years ago at a ceremony so beautiful it made grown men dab their eyes, and I had stood there in my good suit thinking, this is what you do it all for. This right here, that first morning, before I ever noticed anything wrong with Rosa, I noticed something smaller. Marcus came through the kitchen, balancing a laptop under one arm, reaching for the coffee pot on his way past. His elbow clipped the sugar bowl. It rattled against the counter. Nothing broken, nothing spilled. Sorry, he said immediately. Nobody had spoken. Nobody had complained. He apologized to an empty kitchen, to a sugar bowl, to no one, and kept walking like the apology had cost him nothing at all to produce. I remember thinking, briefly and without much weight behind it, that he sounded like a man answering a question no one had asked. Then I forgot about it, the way you forget 100 small things a day, because nothing yet had taught me to hold on to it. Rosa had worked for them since before the wedding. She was warm and sharp and remembered that I took my coffee with 1 sugar, and she hummed under her breath while she washed dishes, some tune I never recognized enough to name, and she laughed at my jokes even when they didn't deserve it, which is the real measure of a person's character. She was almost family. That Monday morning, she arrived wearing sunglasses inside the house, which she had never done before, and when she bent to pick up a grocery bag near the kitchen island, and her sleeve slid back, I saw the bruising around her wrist. Dark and deliberate, the kind that comes from a grip rather than a bump. She pulled the sleeve down before I could say a word. Too early for Hollywood? I said, nodding at the sunglasses, keeping my voice easy. She smiled without showing her teeth. Didn't sleep much. I didn't push. A man my age learns that pushing too fast closes doors you may need later. I poured my coffee and let her get on with her morning, and carried what I'd seen back to the guest house with me, and sat with it the way you sit with something you aren't ready to name yet. The AI sent the same notification 3 days later. Kitchen zone, 7:14 a.m. Then again 2 days after that. Same room, same time. I noticed something else too, something I almost didn't think worth writing down. It never once happened on a weekend. Weekdays only, like clockwork. I remember thinking that was an odd fact about the weather, the kind you notice without connecting it to anything. It would be months before I understood exactly what made weekdays different. I mentioned it to Olivia one afternoon, while she was trimming flowers at the kitchen counter, arranging them with the same focused attention she gave everything she did. She looked at my tablet, and for just a moment, half a second, maybe less, something in her face went very still before the smile arrived. I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking right at her. "I've actually been worried about Rosa myself," she said. I looked up. Her younger brother's been having problems back home. She got another call this morning before you came in. I think she's carrying a lot more than she lets on. She touched my arm lightly. These systems hear stress. They don't know where it comes from. It made sense. Too much sense. I nodded, felt mildly foolish for having worried, and went back to the guest house, believing the matter had been settled by someone who knew Rosa better than I did. But the notifications kept coming. Rosa grew quieter through November. She stopped humming over the dishes. She stopped drinking the cup of coffee she used to take on her break, stopped eating the lunch she brought from home, stopped laughing at anything. Her pattern had broken completely, and the shape of the break troubled me more than I could explain. One morning I came into the main house early and walked into the kitchen to find Olivia standing very still near the counter. Rosa was at the sink. Neither of them spoke. The silence that filled the room was not the comfortable silence of two people were near each other. It was the pressed, careful silence of two people who had just stopped doing something they didn't want witnessed. Rosa dropped a glass. It didn't break, but the sound it made against the sink was the loudest thing in the room. Neither woman looked at me directly. I said good morning, poured my coffee, and left. I drove to the hardware store for absolutely nothing, and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to decide if I was a grieving old widower inventing problems in his son's house, or a man who had spent his whole life learning to read rooms and was reading this one correctly. I invited Rosa for coffee that afternoon. Casual, the way I always had. "Coffee this afternoon?" I asked. She hesitated. For just a second, I thought she might say yes. Instead, she smiled sadly. "Some jobs are harder to leave than people think." I assumed she meant the paycheck. I would spend weeks discovering she meant something else entirely. I started writing things down that evening. Dates, times, the notifications. An old man's notepad, filling up with small observations that individually meant nothing. Then the AI sent a notification that stopped me cold. Repeated elevated vocal stress detected over 17 consecutive mornings. 17. The number had been kept somewhere in the system the whole time, accumulating quietly, while I had been deleting individual alerts and accepting Olivia's explanations and talking myself back from the edge of believing what I was beginning to believe. There was something else I'd started noticing, something that had nothing to do with the tablet at all. Marcus kept his calendar visible on the kitchen counter, an old habit from before everything went digital, a paper planner he still filled in by hand out of some stubborn loyalty to how his mother used to do it. I'd glance at it some mornings without meaning to, and I noticed that his earliest meetings, the ones that put him out the door before 8, almost always fell on Mondays and the first weekday after a holiday, never on a Wednesday, never on a random Thursday. I didn't think much of it at the time. A man schedules his week however he schedules it. It was only much later that I understood he'd been doing it without even realizing it himself. Putting himself somewhere else, anywhere else, on the mornings right after he'd had 2 full days at home, to dread going back to that kitchen. I called Henry Lee the next morning. Henry had worked homicide for 22 years before he retired, and now he consulted on digital evidence for attorneys and insurance investigators, and, occasionally, for old friends who showed up at his door with a notepad full of timestamps. He read through my notes twice without saying anything. "You don't actually trust computers," he said when he finished. "I trust patterns. I said. The computer just collects them. What I wanted was simple. I had full family access to Marcus's smart home account, and I wanted Henry to help me understand what the system had actually recorded, not just the summary alerts, but the archive underneath them. We spent an afternoon at his table pulling 2 months of logs from the kitchen zone. The smart home system had kept basic sound and activity logs, motion history, door activity, ambient noise. Henry leaned in close to one graph and was quiet for a long moment. Could just be someone cleaning, he said, half to himself. Then he shook his head. Except nobody cleans the same way for 4 minutes every weekday at exactly the same time. He tapped the screen. Listen to this. Every morning, the microphone suddenly sounds muffled, like somebody threw a towel over it. The pattern was so consistent it looked manufactured. Every weekday, between 7:11 and 7:15, the kitchen recorded a spike in ambient vocal stress. The spike lasted almost exactly 4 minutes. Then it dropped to baseline, and the muffled sound disappeared with it. Rosa always wiped down the kitchen counters after breakfast, including the smart speaker, as part of her routine. But she did it before those 4 minutes, not during them. And after the speaker was uncovered, the motion sensor showed Rosa leaving the kitchen immediately, without her usual pause to drink her coffee. Looking back, I think she left because staying had become harder than leaving. At the time, I didn't understand why. I drove back to Marcus's house the next morning, intending to finally ask Rosa directly if she needed help. I rehearsed the words in the car. She wasn't there. Olivia answered the door with her warm, practiced smile and told me Rosa had quit. No notice, no explanation. These things happen, she said, tilting her head with something that resembled sympathy. I think she found something closer to home. I stood on that porch and let myself believe, for one long and grateful moment, that the matter had resolved itself the easy way. I wanted that to be true more than I have wanted almost anything. It would have meant Marcus's house was still the home I believed it was. I drove back to the guest house that evening and didn't open the tablet at all. For the first time in 6 weeks, I slept without checking it. The relief lasted 4 days. I called Henry on Friday, mostly to tell him he could stop looking. He was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment. Arthur, he said, the logs don't stop when Rosa does. He was right. The kitchen zone had registered its stress spike again that very Monday at 7:14, exactly as before, and every Monday since. Rosa had been a witness. She had not been the target. I began watching my son. Marcus had always been lean, but he was thinner now in a way that didn't look like discipline. He apologized for things he had no reason to apologize for. The same reflex I'd seen weeks earlier over a rattled sugar bowl. Except now I was paying attention. And now it happened more than once an hour. One evening, I watched him reach for his phone at the dinner table. He glanced toward Olivia first. A small, fast look, barely a flicker, and something in his shoulders eased when she didn't react. Then he put the phone away, without reading whatever had come through. Henry pulled Marcus's smartwatch data, with Marcus's own account access. Every weekday morning, between 7 and 7:20, Marcus's heart rate spiked sharply, and his stress index pushed into the red zone. Like a man bracing for something he knew was coming. I asked Marcus to take a drive with me on a Saturday, the way we used to when he was a teenager. We drove out past the reservoir where we used to fish, and I said what I had been building toward for 3 months. I need you to tell me what happens in the kitchen before you leave for work. He looked through the windshield for so long I wondered if he'd heard me at all. Dad, he said, finally. Another pause, longer than the first. If I tell you, you're never going to look at her the same way again. I don't want to look at her the same way, I said. I want to look at you and know you're safe. He nodded once, like that was permission he'd been waiting for. Then my son, this man I had watched build something from nothing, this man who had called me every Sunday morning, without fail, put his face in his hands, and came apart in the passenger seat of my car. I had seen my son cry only 3 times in his life. The morning his mother died. The afternoon we buried the old shepherd he'd grown up with. And now. This was the hardest of the 3. Grief had taken tears from him before. This time, it was fear finally running out of places to hide. It came out slowly, in fragments and long pauses. Olivia had isolated him from his friends, one cancellation at a time. She had positioned herself between Marcus and his company's finances until he couldn't authorize his own payroll without her countersignature. She monitored his anxiety medication and withheld it on mornings when she wanted him compliant, which gave her reason to tell his own employees, gently, that Marcus had been struggling and might need them to defer more decisions to her. Every morning before he left for work, she cornered him in the kitchen for 4 minutes. Weekends, I understood now, were the only mornings she left him alone, which was why the alerts had only ever come Monday through Friday. The threats varied. Sometimes she would file for divorce and take half the company. Sometimes she would tell his board she had documentation of erratic behavior going back years. More than once she told him she would call the police and claim that I had threatened her, a 68-year-old man living in a guest house recovering from knee surgery. She said it the way you say something you've thought through carefully, which was the most frightening part. Rosa had walked in on it on her 3rd morning of work, and she had stayed and said nothing until the weight of being a witness became heavier than the weight of leaving without explanation. I drove Marcus home, and we sat in the driveway. He didn't say anything for a while, just sat there with his hands on the wheel, breathing like a man who'd set something down after carrying it a very long way. Then he asked me, quietly, if I thought Olivia would go to prison. I told him I didn't know. I told him it didn't matter yet. What mattered was that he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. We're not proving one bad morning, I told him. We're proving a system, and systems leave evidence. Henry spent 3 weeks helping Marcus's attorney organize the archive into a timeline. Marcus's smartwatch data charted into 17 weeks of morning stress spikes with a precision no attorney could dismiss as coincidence. Phone recordings Marcus made himself over the following 2 months, on his attorney's advice. Financial records showing the incremental tightening of Olivia's control over accounts Marcus had opened before he'd ever met her. Rosa came back voluntarily. She sat across a table from a detective and described what she had witnessed on 43 separate mornings, with a precision and composure that I suspect surprised everyone in the room except me. When the detective asked her, gently, why she hadn't said something sooner, to Marcus, to anyone, Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't report a fire from inside the house. You just try to find the door." Nobody in that room asked her to explain what she meant. Everybody understood it perfectly. She also told them, in a flat voice that was somehow worse than tears, about the afternoon, Olivia had gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise it, a quiet warning about what would happen if Rosa ever repeated what she'd seen. When she mentioned, almost in passing, that she was an only child, I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. A former assistant at Marcus's company corroborated the same patterns from the professional side. 2 neighbors described a specific morning in August when they'd heard a voice through an open window issuing threats in a register that did not sound like an argument between equals. The emergency protective order was granted in January. The criminal complaint for coercive control moved more slowly, but it moved. No single piece of testimony carried the case. The pattern did. 47 mornings of documented evidence, assembled by an old man with a notepad and a tablet he mostly used for the weather. By March, Marcus had changed the kitchen back to the way it looked when he first bought the house. He was sleeping better. He laughed at dinner the way he hadn't in years, with his whole face, without checking to see how the sound landed on someone else. Rosa opened her cleaning company in April. 3 employees to start, a fourth by summer. I wrote her the first check myself, which she tried to refuse, and I told her the same thing my father once told me. Receiving grace is also a practice. She folded the check into her pocket and hugged me in a coffee shop parking lot, and didn't apologize for the tears this time. Marcus and I eat breakfast together on Saturday mornings now. At the big kitchen table, with the new chairs, with the smart speaker sitting openly on the counter. Its small indicator light green and steady. The AI still sends me its morning summary. No unusual distress detected. I read it once, then set the tablet down beside my coffee. It takes less than a second now, no hesitation, no decision to make. Some mornings I don't open it at all. Not because I've stopped paying attention. I will always pay attention. It is simply the way I am built. But because there is a difference between watching for danger and needing it to be there. The house sounds like a house now. Ordinary morning sounds. Coffee brewing. A chair scraping. Marcus coughing once in the hallway. I drink my coffee and listen to all of it, and I do not need a notification to tell me that everything, for the first time in a long time, is exactly as it should be.